Good day, everyone. I am Rosamae Casaljay, and I'm about to discuss the topic of classroom assessment. Let us first define what is an assessment. Assessment is a key element of teaching. In addition to that, assessment is a necessary part of teaching in order to determine students' current learning levels and also the effectiveness of the instructional materials and strategies, and also if there is any improvements that should be taken into consideration for future planning of lessons and assistance for students. Next, we have the classroom assessment. What is a classroom assessment? Actually, classroom assessment, it is a systematic approach that used to determine how much and how well the students are learning. In addition to that, assessment is one of the most important aspects of teaching and learning a language. That is why there are two main objectives of an assessment, the summative assessment and instructional feedback for learners' development. In conducting an assessment, it is very important that the different tools be valid. When we say valid or the validity, it means it is essential to all educational assessment as well as language testing. So it means that language testing and all forms of educational assessment are based on the validity theory. Next, we have the validity of the exam must be interpreted when discussing the classroom evaluation. Next is, when we say validity theory, validity in language testing is about how logical and true interpretations and decisions are made based on scores from assessment. In other words, in language testing, validity refers to the degree to which judgments and interpretations are based on test results. So assessment scores are reasonable and accurate. And also, validity has been considered a trait of test. A test is valid if it measures what it has to measure and nothing more. In a classroom assessment, validity and reliability must be interpreted to show how well a method measures something. When we say validity, it refers to the accuracy of a measure, whether the results really do represent what they are supposed to measure. While reliability, it can also mean truthfulness, which means or refers to the consistency of a measure, whether the results can be reproduced under the same conditions. Now we have the classroom assessment and larger scale educational assessment. The difference between classroom assessment and larger scale educational assessment is the context of the classroom and the learners and teachers. In larger scale educational assessment, tests are designed with certain skill or language properties, while in classroom assessment, lesson is developed with learning objectives where any task can be an occasion for assessment of the teaching and learning procedures. Now we have the pedagogy and the measurement paradigm. So when we say pedagogy, that is the practice and method of teaching that occurs during the process of teaching and learning. Conversely, the term measurement paradigm, it describes the framework that educators use to evaluate the learning of their students. In a classroom, teachers usually understand a great deal about the knowledge, abilities, and skills of the learners in the classroom. Teachers also observe learners participate in a wide range of activities and tasks, while learners, they usually grow as competent and independent individuals. In addition to that, teachers' instructional judgments are informed by the evidence of student learning that is gathered via a well-designed classroom assessment plan. And it also it gives teachers knowledge about what their students are capable of. And aside from that, teachers must also be aware of the misunderstandings that students have in order to create effective lessons. Because of the context of the classroom, the tasks and activities, the teachers, the relationships and interactions, the learners grow as individuals as their horizons are widened through participation and the acquisition of new cultural knowledge. And now we have the context as one of the factors in the success of the assessment. The term context is actually used in a variety of contexts in language instruction, such as first, the setting in which the language is being taught, and if the language you are teaching has a social demand, and also if the students that are most likely to be in your class. So the behavior is influenced by context. For example, my score is probably going to be worse than it would be if the climate were more conducive to concentration, such as in a hot room where I take an exam. Furthermore, in validity theory, the classroom is a social institution in which our understanding of the learner is partly based on how they interact with their environment and the others in it. So the context of a language test is environment in which the test takes place. First, the room where the learners will sit. The second is the proctor who shows them to their seats and supervises the test, and the decoration, temperature, and all other factors. So all of these factors are assumed to be irrelevant to the test itself. But if any of these factors become salient in testing the context, we would suspect that there is something wrong. Other examples are if the test is being held in Egypt during the summer and the air conditioning breaks down, the temperature factor becomes salient. Next is if a test taker is expected to write for an hour while seated on an uncomfortable wooden chair, we may suspect that the score may not represent the learner's optimal ability to write. So context in validity theory usually referred to as one part of construct irrelevant variance. According to some writers, construct irrelevant variance it is the introduction of extraneous, uncontrolled variables that affect assessment outcomes. The meaningfulness and accuracy of examination is adversely affected, and the legitimacy of decisions made upon exam results is affected as well, and the validity is reduced. So by this uncontrolled variable, it influences the results of assessments. For example, exam results lose some of their significance and precisions. So the validity of decisions based on them is compromised and the validity is diminished. Moreover, it should be the test taker's ability on the construct that causes the test score to be high or low. So the test taker's proficiency with the construct should determine whether the result is high or poor. And also, if these scores vary because of contextual factor, the variability in the scores is construct irrelevant. So the scores variability is construct irrelevant if it results from the contextual factors, for example, the room decoration, the room temperature, and the environment itself. When we say contextual factors, these are various elements within an environment, such as physical surroundings, cultural norms, social structures, and economic conditions, which influence individuals' behaviors, decisions, and social interactions. Next, in the classroom, the context is the learning environment and constructed sets of learning experience. So the context is the learning environment and constructed sets of learning experience that are designed to lead to the acquisition of language and communication. So this context is not construct irrelevant but directly relevant to the assessment of the learners. To test how well the students are progressing can be assessed only in relation to their involvement with the context and the others with whom they interact in the process of learning. That is why the context is part of the construct. For tasks and items, in a traditional large-scale language test, learners spend anything between 1 hour and 5 hours responding to a large number of tasks and test items. So learners answer to a huge number of exercises and test items in a standard large-scale language test over the course of 1 to 5 hours. So it is divided into several papers, each identified by a skill. And so it has become accepted that the more tasks or items a test contains, the more reliable and valid it is likely to be. But it's now common knowledge that an exam will probably be more genuine and dependable the more tasks or thing it includes. Next is, in larger scale language tests, the assumption is that a fairly good picture of a learner's ability can be achieved only if that learner responds to many different items. So each item must contribute as much unique information as possible to the meaning of the total test score. Next is, the response to each item or task must be independent of the responses to other items or tasks. And in the measurement literature surrounding multiple choice items is referred to as the principle of stochastic independence. So in a test, we collect pieces of information from many independent responses. We add them together in some way and report a number that we claim means something about the ability of the learner on the intended outcomes. A mark of a good task design is for range of tasks to be interlinked. So this principle means the occurrence of one does not affect the probability of occurrence of the other, or equivalently does not affect the odds, so that each successive task it builds upon what has gone before in a way that takes the learner one step beyond what they can currently do. Now, we have the types of evidence. So first we have how students engage in task. And next we have ongoing conversations, followed by interactions with others and knowledge of the resources available to the learners. So these four are types of evidence in making judgments about the learning success of the students. In conducting an assessment, it is very important to have an assessor. So we have here the role of the assessor. In large-scale tests, designers try to design tasks that can be scored by machines. For example, the multiple choice item. It is the most efficient item type in maximizing information or test information. Next, we have in a classroom, human assessors or raters are used to evaluate performances, especially in writing and speaking. In the case of writing, it is normally expected that the scripts are graded anonymously, and it is usually expected also that teachers do not know the person whose performance they are rating. Next is the teachers act as assessors in the classroom. It is true because the teacher is familiar with each learner and the teacher interacts with each learner. And the purpose of the interaction is not to assess in the most neutral or non-invasive way, but rather to assess the current abilities of the learners to decide what to do next. So, this traditional terminology, this makes a classroom assessment formative than summative. Another thing is assessment and learning are integrated within the classroom. So through the use of student evaluation, the teachers can assess how well they are teaching by connecting student performance to predetermine the learning goals. And also, according to Vygotsky, the notion of the zone of proximal development or that space between what the individual can accomplish independently and what he or she can do with assistance. Now we have the designing and evaluating. So in language tests, the language tests are designed by teachers with a particular skill and training in test design. This is not because a test task always looks different from a classroom, but because a test task is usually designed with certain properties in mind. Yet, these are not necessary in the class, where any task is an opportunity for assessment that leads to an adjustment of the learning process. Next is, classroom activities are not imposed by the teacher, and the tasks grow out of perceptions of learning need that are negotiated by participants. So the evaluation need not be done by the teacher alone, but by the learners themselves in peer evaluation. And outcomes are not scored in traditional ways, but evaluated in terms of how successfully the tasks were undertaken. Is this approach to classroom assessment implies that learners are not ranked in any way. So this method of evaluating students in the classroom suggests that there is no ranking system in place. Next is the teacher and learners together negotiate what constitutes successful task completion and successful learning. So together, the teachers and the students decide what makes for a successful assignment finish and learning experiences. So the assessment that takes place is criterion reference. So this is linked to the agreed criteria that a learner is ready to proceed to the next learning activity. So this is something that learners and the school may not always want, because students prefer to get a grade that shows where they are with in regards to their peers and learners in other places. In the classroom learning environment, it is feedback to the learner from any source that helps him or her to identify what needs to be learned next to become an independent user of language in a new context. So this means that the feedback must contain diagnostic information, and this is not usually found in format tests. Next, we have assessment is performance-based. So performance-based elements in large-scale testing are usually restricted to a small number of control task types, usually involving writing and speaking. Next is, in the classroom, the activities and assessment are almost entirely performance-based and completely integrated. The reason for this is simply that they demand significant resources to implement and are expensive. This is particularly the case for assessing speaking, and this is not surprising because it is a social learning environment that encourages interaction, communication, and achieving shared goals and providing feedback from learner to learner as well as teacher to learners. Another thing is, a particular feature of the classroom context is collaboration between learners. So student cooperation is one aspect of the educational environment that stands out. And so, one of the principles underlying task and item design in large-scale testing is that they should be independent. However, collaboration in a test is usually described more as cheating. So the responses of any one individual to a task or an item should be independent of the responses or any other individual. In an exam, working together is typically referred to more negatively as cheating. But in a performance-based, group speaking test is an exception. Next is, collaboration is encouraged in developing writing skills and the presentation of portfolios of work. Working together actually is to show work portfolios, and handwriting abilities is encouraged. So anyone who thinks within the bounds of traditional validity theory will begin to worry whether it is possible to make inferences from anything to the abilities of an individual. In general, validity theory in large-scale testing is extremely concerned with this course. And now we have estimates of reliability in large-scale testing are based upon four assumptions. The first one is stability. So the aim of assessment in the classroom is to make score meaning obsolete as quickly as possible. So while in a stable environment, test takers' abilities are expected to be relatively constant over short time periods. So in a classroom setting, learners' abilities are expected to fluctuate as new material is introduced and ongoing evaluation informs instruction. The second is discrimination. Tests are constructed in such a way that they discriminate as well as possible between the better and poorer test takers, and the quality of the individual test items or task is dependent upon its discriminatory properties. So in the classroom, the teacher does not often wish to separate out all individuals and rank order them, as it serves no pedagogic purpose. Rather, the teacher wishes to know if any individual has achieved the goals of the syllabus and can move on to learn new material, or whatever it is necessary to recycle previous material. The third is test length. So it means traditional measures of reliability are closely tied to the length of the test. So it means that the more items or tasks are included in the test, the higher the reliability coefficient will be. Fourth is the uniformity. So in large scale testing, all the tasks or items measure the same construct, and so the items are related or correlated to each other. It means that each piece of information is independently contributing to the test score, and the test score is the best possible representation of the knowledge, abilities, or skills of the test taker. Since it has always been stated in the language testing literature that without reliability, there could be no validity. And so, if the scores were not stable and dependable, they could not be meaningful. And also, it was considered by most that validity can emerge where consistency is not present. Next, can a test be valid but not reliable? Hmm? Okay. According to some writers, reliability and validity are not mutually exclusive. A test might have reliability without validity. This is due to the possibility that a test may yield consistent while not truly assessing the intended outcomes. Lastly, the context requires that the learning experience is integrated and relevant to the needs of the learners, and the personal knowledge of the learner and the process of learning is taken into account in assessment that informs future learning. That ends the classroom assessment. That would be all. Thank you.